Hello everyone, here we are continuing our Unit 5 review videos, here with our next topic, boundaries. I'm going to go over boundaries, their effects, types of boundaries, boundary disputes, and touch a little bit on one big topic in boundaries, the law of the sea. All right, here we go. So, we have lots of different types of borders and boundaries, physical, relic, superimposed, consequent, subsequent, geometric, etc., etc. We're not going to go over every single type of these boundaries. Uh, Really, the underlying reason why we look at these boundaries is so that we can understand the conflicts that happen thereafter, right? But you're not going to get any sort of definition questions, or you're going to have to define a superimposed boundary. That's not going to happen. They'll more than likely give you that definition, but we do want to understand how some of these boundaries occur, examples of these boundaries in historical or contemporary space, and more importantly, the results that happen after, right? Environmentally in the space and between people, cultures, states, etc. So we're really only going to focus on these three particular types of boundaries: superimposed, subsequent, and consequent. These are the ones that we see most often, at least in terms of conflicts. And so we're going to focus in on these to start. Now, our superimposed boundaries are any boundaries established over top or without regard for existing cultural patterns. And usually that means existing cultural boundaries. And we can see here a classic example of ethnic groups in Africa as compared to current political boundaries in Africa, which, as we have looked at, were established by outside external powers, the European colonists, French and the German and the Italians and the Dutch and so on and so forth, which have these same political boundaries that we have today. But those boundaries did not coincide with cultural patterns. Right here we can see in some cases, like in Cameroon, these boundaries that were created actually split cultural groups or split ethnic groups from themselves, from each other, from people of that same ethnic or cultural uh, grouping. In other cases, we had maybe in a space that had a majority of one ethnicity thrown into a space where they were now the minority. Again, as a result of these external forces or powers, right? These groupings were not drawn according, the political boundaries that we see today were not drawn according to these cultural groupings. They were drawn according to European whims and wishes, right? Who wanted to control which areas, who wanted which resources, where those resources were plentiful, and who eventually ended up getting control of those spaces. We didn't have anything according to those classic boundaries, those cultural boundaries from before. And so these are superimposed, right? They're over top, right? We can see they actually are over some of these areas where we have here, we call them partition ethnicities and ethnic groups that were split because of these new boundaries. And that itself can lead to conflict because maybe the groupings in a new area who are now confined by these novel political boundaries don't necessarily agree with each other, right? There's reasons why we have these cultural distinctions. One, because people who are going to group with people of similar characteristics, that's what makes up some ethnicities in some cases, along with shared histories and other things. But they might not necessarily agree with another culture group, and they, by extension, separate themselves from that group to prevent conflict, or at the very least, to make their lives easier. With these new boundaries, some of these groups that disagreed with each other, either violently or peacefully, were now forced into the same space, and that can cause problems too. The second type of boundary we look at is subsequent. It's a boundary established after conflict or cultural change. And so we see this partition of India, which is a result of some conflict, some revolt on the side of people in India against British rule, but the British were losing control. This is after World War One. And World War II have occurred. So we see this weakening of British control by extension because there's a lot of debt that's happening. There's a lot of state change that needs to happen in England, will become the United Kingdom. Too far. And so we end up with this partition of India, right, based on cultural identities. The culture here and the conflict that we were seeing between, again, the Muslim north of what was India as a whole and the majority Hindu south. Which is the majority of this Indian subcontinent. So we see this partition splitting India into three separate states. One, Pakistan to the northwest, India as a whole, and Bangladesh, which has this very complicated border here, where parts of India are still surrounding Bangladesh, right? That's the issue unto itself. Um, we see this happen after World War I and World War II, which we looked at in the previous video, where we see these conflicts happen and we see empires themselves change and fall apart and become independent states. These new boundaries are these subsequent boundaries. And again, in a lot of cases, like in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these boundaries were established after the fact to accommodate certain cultures. Even then, further down the line, right, like Czechoslovakia splits to become Czechia and Slovakia because, again, of separate identities and what we might call self-determination of both groups to have their own independent states. The last of these consequent boundaries are boundaries according to existing cultural differences or identities. So we already have, like we were looking at in Africa, right? We have this map again, a different map, but looking at the similar things of identities and ethnic groups in Africa, and then a comparison to the actual states that are around. Right? We still have the South Sudan that needs to be here, so that's not quite what we're looking at in terms of modernity, right? Because we still have 2011 to consider. So this is pre-2011. We're going to hope that it's 2010, but there should be another partition here between Sudan and South Sudan, right? Those would be the newest additions that we have. Outside of that, sorry, we have these changes that have occurred, and that's the representation that we see here in the map between establishing these, again, superimposed boundaries, but we're looking previously at these consequent boundaries instead, right? The boundaries that were according to ethnic identities as a result of people establishing their own spaces. We see this with American Indians in North America and indigenous peoples in North America, including Alaska Natives, that also had their own territories and lands established as a result of their cultural differences and identities. Right, and this is very different than the U.S. map that we see today, and unfortunately very different than the reservation map or the provinces like we see with Nunavut today in Canada too. But again, superimposed boundaries that are established after the fact, but these consequent boundaries were originally established, right, by the groups who lived in these areas. Yep. Now, we've looked at these types of boundaries, superimposed, consequent, subsequent, but really what we're looking at is after the facts, right? After these boundaries are established and the conflict that happens as a result of these boundaries being established in the first place, or conflicts that resulted as related to the boundaries being established or the boundaries needing to be created in the first place. And we have these different types of disputes: operational, allocational, definitional, locational. And again, like before, we're not going to look at all of these. We're going to focus on these particular disputes to start with. Operational and allocational. And these are going to be the ones, again, that we see most often, and that'll tie into this law of the sea that we mentioned at the beginning of the video. Now, operational disputes are about passage or immigration through a border. So it's going to be about how that border operates, right? How the border maybe opens, closes, what, or how people and goods are allowed through the border from one end to the next. And there may be disagreement. There may be disagreement on how that happens because the border is going to be between two sovereign states, right? That sovereignty is still going to be established, and so we're going to have these differences between what each of these two states wants to do with or through that border. Now, in Europe, as a result of the European migration crisis, right, lots of migrants and refugees coming out of Africa, out of the Middle East, as a result of the Syrian civil war, as a result of the Sudanese civil war, and other conflicts that are going on in those regions. We had lots of refugees, not as many as who stayed in the regions, but lots compared to prior years, fleeing into Europe, seeking amnesty and seeking safety, right, fleeing for their lives, looking to find a place where they can just live and not have to worry about penalty of death or persecution as a result of their culture, ethnicity. We see refugees fleeing through the southeastern part of Europe, right out of Turkey and into the other regions of Europe up in the north. And what we see happen is Hungary, in particular, looking to close off its borders, not wanting to allow refugees through any longer. This is happening with a lot of other issues, a lot of immigration issues. This raised a lot of kind of nasty business in Europe. over immigration in particular. So there are other countries that were having crises of their own and that were talking about immigration reform and things like that. Hungary is one who very specifically wanted to establish kind of this new border barrier, a la the United States. In doing so, we see conflict between Serbia and Hungary, two different countries who share that border, where Hungary wants to be more strict and close that border off, and where Serbia is not quite agreeing with the changes being proposed. So we see conflict happen in these spaces between these two countries. And naturally, any border disputes can lead to conflict between two countries because that border, by definition, divides two separate states, at least in terms of our context and political geography. And so we're going to have, at the very minimum, two separate states, two sovereign separate states that are going to be disagreeing about how that border works. In this case of an operational dispute. In the United States, we see something similar with immigration on how the U.S.-Mexico border is going to operate on either side, from the U.S. to the Mexico side, Mexico to the U.S. side. And in both cases, there are other economic implications. In the U.S. more so because we have NAFTA that we're worried about, right? This North American Free Trade Agreement, this agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and the United States to make trade easier, more beneficial, more profitable. And so there are other issues to consider here, right? So it's not strictly an immigration issue in a lot of cases. There are also economic implications therein. The second type of dispute we look at is what we call allocational disputes. And allocational disputes are disputes over resources, and how to allocate something. We allocate something, we set it aside for future use. These allocational disputes are about the resources that could be used either in the present or in the future. Now, this has a lot to do with the Law of the Sea, what we call UNCLOS for short, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this Law of the Sea establishes guidelines for control, right? Again, we're back to this territoriality piece, right? It's still in the back of people's heads, back of states' heads, on how to control spaces like the ocean, because that's a difficult thing to parse. With land, at least you have these set like natural borders of where the land starts and ends. The ocean, it's a little more difficult, especially in the case in this area to the east of China, between South Korea, Japan, and China, where we have overlap, right? Where we have lots of countries bordering a particular swath of ocean. Excuse me. All of whom are looking to control this particular space. Now, the Law of the Sea states that states have sovereignty, full sovereignty 12 miles out from the shoreline, their territorial waters. What we're more concerned about is the EEZ, these exclusive economic zones, where states, according to this convention in the UNCLOS, have full economic sovereignty, which means sovereignty below the water in terms of resources, up to 200 miles off of their coast. Now, for the most part, this doesn't really matter because you can have a country and a coastline and it extends to 200 miles and you have your exclusive economic zone, all hunky-dory, well and good. The issue is when we have cases like these particular regions to the east of China, where we have multiple countries, in this case, two would be bad enough, but here we have more than two, who have overlapping exclusive economic zones, whose 200 miles extends into someone else's 200 miles. And so we get these allocational disputes thereof. In this case, we may have natural resources like this gas field that we have here. It may be about fishing resources. Right? Overfishing has been a big problem throughout the world, but especially in East Asia, in this area where seafood is much more predominant of a staple in diets in the region. So we tend to see more seafood that's being collected. We see larger industries of seafaring. It's not to say it doesn't happen in the Western Hemisphere. We just see it happen a lot in the East, and that's where we've seen a lot of conservation efforts happen. But we have this overlap now, right? And we have this dispute between these countries about who's going to take control of these spaces. One of the issues here is definitely the resource control, right? That's what makes it this allocational dispute. How do we divide this resource that could potentially make lots of money? Or the fishing resources, which could potentially provide lots of money and lots of food. The other issue is just territoriality at play, right? These countries want to have as much control over the space as possible and may feel threatened by other countries who are who have impending stakes on their proposed self-owned areas. This extension, right? And here we can see different codes in our key. So we're thinking yes with the EEZs, and we see this overlap between Japan's EEZ and China's EEZ. But we also have militaristic tendencies of conflict here. One, because these countries may not agree with each other in the first place, but we also have what we call these air defense areas that also overlap. So there's other issues that are here uh, because of the proximity of these countries to each other. And this UN Plus is one of these issues that, yes, is extending this area, but doesn't quite solve the issue because of these exception cases. Now, we see this in the Arctic Circle as well. That Arctic Circle at the northernmost part of the world, right? There are lots of natural resources, oil and minerals and things that are there too. But we also have lots of country borders who are um, close by, right? So we have this kind of ring of countries like Canada, parts of the US, like Alaska, Russia, who all kind of coalesce and coincide with each other at the top of the world and who want control over those spaces. But again, those exclusive economic zones overlap, and it becomes more difficult to do and to navigate because of that. We looked at all these borders and boundaries and disputes thereof. Hopefully this video is helpful to you. In the next video, the last one, we're going to look at all we've looked at before on nations and states and borders, boundary disputes. And we're going to look at some of the forces behind political change and political conflict, like centrifugal forces, devolution, so on and so forth. And that'll close us out for this unit. Again, hoping this has been helpful to you. Hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe. And we'll see you next time.